Well, hi there. Welcome back to Professor Snyder's. It's me, Music Biz News. Back in 1968, James Taylor recorded a record for the Beatles. His first album was put out by Apple Records. And on that album, there was a song called Carolina in My Mind. And years later, in the 1970s, James Taylor had left Apple Records and signed with Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers wanted to put out a James Taylor's Greatest Hits. Because of the difficulty of obtaining licensing rights from Apple during the 1970s, James Taylor decided to do an end run by re-recording the song. They didn't have to pay Apple Records to use the song on the Best Of compilation album. That's the version that you hear on the radio. Most of you have probably never heard the original Beatles version of James Taylor's record. So that leads to now, after Taylor Swift, as everybody knows, decided to re-record her original records because Scooter Braun and Big Machine Records had sold her first 6 albums to Shamrock Capital. And as of, I think, last month, she announced that she was able to buy back those original recordings. Taylor Swift officially owns all her music. The Grammy winner recently bought back her masters, announcing the news in an open letter to fans published on Friday, May 30th. Per Billboard, Shamrock Capital, who purchased Taylor's masters from Scooter Braun's Ithaca Holdings in 2020, sold her the catalog for $360 million, which is relatively close to what they paid for it in the first place. And she got more than just her masters. This also included all the master recordings to her first 6 albums and music videos, concert films, album art, photos, and unreleased material. So while you Swiftie fans are out there high-fiving each other because Taylor Swift had an extra $360 million to use to buy the original master recordings, and the press is all over it because they finally have some kind of a positive Cinderella story as far as Taylor Swift and her music. Please forgive me if I get into the weeds a little bit as I try to explain this whole thing about master recordings, so you understand actually why she did it and why James Taylor did it. First, when an artist records a record, there are 2 areas of copyright that they typically have to be concerned about. One is the ownership by the songwriters themselves. Who wrote the melody, who wrote the lyrics. The song itself, like you might sing when you're in the shower. The other is the sound recording that is produced by going into a recording studio and recording the song being performed. And that leads to masters, which would be, what I'm going to refer to sort of as like this, tape of original masters that I have, still from way back. Typically, the songwriter owns the song, lyrics and the melody. But the record label that would have paid for the song to be recorded in the recording studio owns the master tapes, the recordings of the song itself. So whenever somebody wants to use the song, like in a movie, they have to get permission from both the songwriter and from the record label if they want to use the original recording. As I went into the Salt and Pepper episode, typically the record label will allow an artist to reclaim those master tapes as their own after 35 years of them being released. Also back then, it was typical practice for a record label to allow an artist to re-record a song after 3 years, because the thinking was back then that an artist wouldn't be able to afford to go back into the studios and re-record the songs. Why would they want to? They're under contract. And the idea that only the record labels had complete control of distribution and marketing and licensing. So they thought, sure, you can re-record your song in 3 years, and most of them never did because there was no reason for them to. Here's an example of how a song is broken into two parts. In the 1980s, Nike wanted to do a commercial, sneaker commercial, and they wanted to use the song Revolution by the Beatles. And they got permission to use the song by those that represented the songwriters, Lennon and McCartney. So they used it in a Nike commercial, the song Revolution. The Revolution ad debuted Thursday, March 26, 1987 on NBC's top-rated The Cosby Show. On July 28th, Apple Records filed suit against EMI Records, Capitol Records, Nike, and W&K for $15 million, claiming damages for the use of the song. They meant the recording of the song that Apple Records owned. In a sense, the Beatles were suing themselves because Nike got permission to use the song, but they did not get permission to use the sound recording. They have to do both. So you may have noticed this in commercials. Companies who don't want to pay record labels for using the actual recordings of a song will now often get permission by the writers, but then record sound-alike recordings of the songs to bypass the record label. They don't have to get permission from the record label to use the actual original recording. And sometimes they get caught, such as in the 1980s when singer Bette Midler sued over a sound-alike version of her recording of Do You Want to Dance being used in a commercial by the Ford Motor Company, which sounded too close to the original. So the idea is that people hear a commercial, they recognize the song, it sounds very similar to the original version of it, but it's a sound-alike. So that gives you an idea how it came to be that Swift, as a songwriter, owned the songs, but not the actual recordings or the tapes. And not wanting to wait 35 years to get possession of her original records, she decided to re-record the records so that she would own the master recordings. When Shamrock owned the Big Machine Masters, Swift effectively had veto power over requests for sync licenses. If a music supervisor wanted a track from one of her Big Machine albums, Swift, who is either the sole songwriter or a co-writer on every track, could refuse to grant permission for the publishing rights. And she announced her intention to do just that in an interview. And the reason, she said, I'm re-recording my music next year is because I do want my music to live on. I do want it to be in movies. I do want it to be in commercials. But I only want that if I own it. She insisted that because she was a songwriter, that to use any of her songs, they had to use the re-recorded versions of the songs, like just happened with Look What You Made Me Do, which was used in the final episode of Handmaid's Tale, if you're watching that. So she devalued the original recordings that Shamrock owned to the point that they sold those original recordings back to Taylor Swift for close to what they paid for them originally. In other words, they were happy to pretty well break even. And this re-recording trend is growing. John Fogerty announced he's re-recording songs by Creedence Clearwater Revival. Roger Waters re-recorded Dark Side of the Moon. Def Leppard, Ashanti, and even Journey are doing re-recordings, which could devalue the original recordings, just like Taylor Swift's original recordings were devalued, that are still owned by their record labels. And I hear that the record labels not wanting to be swifted, yes, being swifted is now a verb, Any new record contract now stipulates that an artist cannot re-record a song for 30 years. Which is ironic because, according to copyright law, anybody can cover a song once it's been published. But the original artist can't re-record their song and distribute it. Could be tough days ahead for record labels making money by selling legacy recordings. It's always about the money. And don't forget, this was not Taylor Swift's brilliant idea. From what I can find, I believe it's Frank Sinatra actually who had the original idea of re-recording songs so that he can gain control of his own recordings. Here we are 40, 50 years later, and now everybody's starting to do it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like and all those things if you like these episodes. And here's a little bit of the original James Taylor from Apple. Hopefully they all allow this.
In my mind, I'm gone to Carolina. Can't you see the sunshine? Now can't you just feel the moonshine? And ain't it just like a friend of mine to hit me from behind?